The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, remains one of the most misunderstood conflicts in African history. For decades, this war has been framed as a simple fight to keep Nigeria together, or a struggle caused by tribal tensions. But in reality, the truth is far more convoluted and far more profit-driven than most history books admit. From mid-1967 till early 1970, what seemed to have begun as a political disagreement turned into an international tragedy, becoming the war with the second highest death toll of all African conflicts. In all, more than 2 million people, mostly civilians, lost their lives through violence, starvation, and disease as the Nigerian government fought to prevent the breakaway of the Republic of Biafra. In this video, I'll strip away the propaganda to break down the simple, core reason why Nigeria attacked Biafra. We'll look at why no major country fully supported Biafra and the biggest myths that still distort our understanding of one of Africa's deadliest wars. Please take a moment to like this video. I need all the support I can get. Thank you. To understand the war, we must go much further back than 1967, because when discussing the root of the conflict, one fact stands out. Nigeria was an artificial country. It was simply a composite of people joined together in the interests and for the benefit of a European power. Before colonial rule, the area now called Nigeria contained numerous independent societies, each with its own culture, language, political structure, and identity. In the late 1890s, an Anglo-French agreement settled a territorial crisis between Britain and France and established the borders of Britain's new colony. This colony would later be named Nigeria. The colony was physically split into three by the Niger River and Benue River. The north, consisting of several emirates governed under Islamic law, was occupied by the Hausa, the Kanuri, and the Fulani. The Fulani had originally come south from the Sahara in conquest, bringing with them the Muslim religion. Along the southern fringe of the north is the Middle Belt, inhabited by numerous non-Hausa peoples, who were vassals of the Hausa-Fulani Empire. In the southern region of the colony, the western part was occupied mainly by the Yoruba people, who had a long history of highly developed kingdoms. After colonization, because the British entered the country through Lagos, Western culture first reached the Yoruba and other tribes of the West. Meanwhile, in the eastern part lived a variety of people, the major tribe being the Igbos, who lived on both banks of the Niger, but mainly east of it. The Igbos lived in decentralized communities, often organized into village groups or clans, run on democratic principles. Several minority groups also occupied the Niger Delta and coastal regions of the area. Between the late 1800s and 1914, Britain conquered these territories separately. After conquering the Emirates in the north, the British soldier and administrator Sir Frederick Lugard, who would later become the governor, decided to keep the emir in power and rule through them, rather than rule directly. This indirect rule system worked very well in the north and was cheap for Britain in terms of manpower and investment. In 1914, Lugard merged the north and the south together. The reason for this amalgamation was British administrative convenience, definitely not logic. This forced union became Nigeria. The people living in these lands had no say in their union. As many historians note, Nigeria was created for Britain's benefit, mainly to reduce administrative costs, expand trade, and control newly discovered resources. The problems created by this artificial union would become very clear after independence. Administrative-wise, Lugard also decided to impose the indirect rule system that worked so well in the north on the south. This meant that British officials ruled through local leaders rather than directly. Indirect rule worked in the north because the Hausa people already had strong hierarchies, and the people were used to implicit obedience to their emirs. In the west, indirect rule worked relatively well because Yoruba kingdoms also had established rulers like the Uni of Ife and Alafin of Oyo. But in the east, the system failed completely. The Igbo had no kings. their society was democratic, based on councils and assemblies. Their whole traditional structure makes them virtually immune to dictatorship. And Igbos especially insist on being consulted in everything that concerns them. When the British tried to impose administrators known as warrant chiefs, it was met with resistance and led to uprisings, most famously the Aba Women's War of 1929, when thousands of women protested. Because of the different nature of each region, each part of Nigeria had different attitudes toward authority and experienced colonial rule differently. In the north, the concern of the emirs, like most feudal potentates, was to remain in power in conditions as unchanging as possible. They were, therefore, against the change and progress that would be caused by mass education. To them, Western education was dangerous, and they confined it to the elites. It was not surprising that by the time of Nigeria's independence in 1960, the North had only 41 secondary schools, as against the 842 secondary schools in the South. In contrast to the North, the South, invaded by missionaries, developed an avid thirst for education in all its forms. In the decades from colonization to independence, the difference in the attitudes and values between the North and South and the educational and technological gap became very wide. The British also encouraged competition among the ethnic groups, believing it made ruling easier. This divide and rule approach would have long-lasting consequences. By the 1940s and 1950s, the idea of independence spread across Africa. But Nigeria's major ethnic groups did not agree on several things: how fast it should come, how power should be shared, and what Nigeria should look like after independence. The North took on a cautious and slow attitude. The Northern leadership feared losing political dominance, which had been bestowed on them by the British, if independence came too soon. They worried that the more Western-educated South would take over national politics. Though the West was in favor of immediate independence, the Yoruba elite wanted strong regional autonomy after it. The East was strongly pro-independence. The Igbo, influenced by strong political activism, pushed hardest for early independence. Many Northerners interpreted this as Igbo domination tactics. Before this period, the North had made it clear that it did not want to be amalgamated with the South, but it subsequently agreed to go along if it was given majority seats in the legislation. They also demanded separate regions, as well as regional development. By the late 1950s, the divisions between the tribes were deep, and they would get deeper. After independence, Nigeria politically was supposed to function as a single nation. Instead, politics became a competition between regions and ethnic groups. Political parties were along regional lines, and tribes voted for their region's representative instead of the best candidate. The early 1960s saw a lot of political malfeasance: rigged elections, political intimidation, and power struggles between regional parties. This damaged public trust. The discovery of oil intensified political competition. Every region wanted control of federal power because federal power meant access to resources. Meanwhile, Igbo people migrated across Nigeria in search of business opportunities and were becoming economically successful in the other regions. Due to the North's reservations about education and modernization, job openings for clerks, switchboard operators, engineers, bank tellers, factory staff, and many more in the North were filled by Southerners, mostly from the East. So much so that by 1966, there were about 1,300,000 Easterners in the northern region, and about 500,000 in the West. Some Northerners felt threatened by the Easterners' success. This was expressed succinctly by Sir Ahmadu Bello.
Well, the Igbos are more or less the type of people whose desire is mainly to dominate everybody. If they go to a village, to a town, they want to monopolize everything in that area. If you put them in a labor camp as a laborer, within a year they will try to emerge as headman of that camp. and so on. Well, in the past, our people were not alive to their responsibilities, because you can see from our northernization policy that in 1952, when I came here, there weren't 10 northerners in our civil service here. Then I tried to have it northernized, and now all important posts are being held by northerners.
These political rivalries, cultural differences, and economic tensions created resentments that would later explode into violence. Nigeria's first military coup took place on January 15, 1966. A small group of junior army officers, mostly of Igbo origin, sought to overthrow what they saw as a corrupt government. Led by the idealistic Major Chukwuma Nziogu, an Igbo who had lived all his life in the north, the coup plotters assassinated several northern and western political leaders, including the Sardauna of Sokoto, Sir Ahmadu Bello and his wife, the Prime Minister, Sir Tafawa Balewa, the Premier of the Western Region, Ladoke Akintola, the Finance Minister, Chief Okoti Ebo, a Midwesterner, the Western Commanding Officer of the 1st Brigade, Brigadier Ademolegun. Although the coup had a sprinkle of participation by other ethnic groups, many believed it was an Igbo plot to dominate Nigeria. Conveniently, the President of the Federation, Sir Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo, was on vacation, and only 2 Igbo officers were killed. The coup failed. But Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo officer who was not part of the coup and was instrumental in foiling it, became head of state. Ironsi's regime was anything but pro-Igbo. His 9-man Supreme Military Council had only one other Igbo apart from himself, and his army chief of staff and right-hand man was Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a northerner. Ironsi, thinking that rigid adherence to regionalism was a problem, attempted to unify Nigeria by ending the federal system. This decision, many northerners interpreted as a further attempt at domination by the Igbos. Because unification seemed particularly advantageous to the Igbos, they were well-traveled, most qualified, and were confident of their ability to compete if given equal opportunities in any of the regions. Ironsi also failed to bring the coup plotters to trial, although they were incarcerated. Northern soldiers responded with a revenge coup on July 29, 1966. This coup, considered Africa's bloodiest coup d'etat, also failed. Ironsi was killed along with hundreds of Igbo military officers and Eastern Region soldiers in barracks all over northern and western Nigeria. Eastern civilians were also killed in the north. The new head of state became Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon. After the counter-coup and the massacres in July, another widespread massacre of Eastern civilians started in the north in September of that same year. Violence spread through many cities, with mobs attacking Igbo homes and businesses. Despite assurances from Colonel Gowon that the killings was a short-lived affair, witnesses testified that it went on sporadically for days. Between 30,000 and 50,000 Easterners were killed, and hundreds of thousands fled back to eastern Nigeria. These massacres, which have been compared to genocides, were a major cause of the East's move to secede. The military governor of the Eastern region, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, became the voice of the Igbo and other Eastern peoples. Ojukwu accused the federal government of failing to protect Eastern citizens, allowing the massacres to occur, not punishing those responsible, and ignoring Eastern demands for security and justice. But from the federal government, there was no expression of regret or remorse, no punishment for the perpetrators, and no compensation for losses or offer to help with the refugee situation that had developed in the East. After the second massacre, Ojukwu urged Igbo people living in other regions to return to the East for safety. Trainloads and truckloads of frightened families arrived daily as confidence in the Nigeria Union faded rapidly. In January 1967, the 4 regional military governors and the Supreme Military Council of Nigeria met in Aburi in Ghana to try to resolve the issues that had turned Nigeria into a nightmare. At the Aburi meeting, several decisions were made, chief of which was that the regions would be given more autonomy, that power would be shared in a confederal structure, and control of the army was to be handed over to the Supreme Military Council. Basically, under the Aburi Accord, Nigeria would become a confederation of states. These decisions were agreed by all and signed off. However, when Gowon returned to Lagos, influenced by powerful northern elements who rightfully realized that the Aburi Agreement severely weakens their position as a central authority, he reinterpreted the agreement and gave a press conference of the revised version, as if that was what was agreed in Aburi. Ojukwu insisted on full implementation of the original Aburi Agreement and released the taped record of the two-day meeting to the public. Gowon refused, claiming that he's come to realize that what was agreed in Aburi gave too much power to the regions. The last hope for peace collapsed. "On Aburi we stand" became the slogan in the East. In late May 1967, the 335-member of the Eastern Consultative Assembly and the Advisory Council of Chiefs and Elders, made up of 169 Igbo and 165 non-Igbo minority group representatives, gave Colonel Ojukwu a unanimous mandate to pull the East out of the Federation of Nigeria and declare it a free, sovereign, and independent state by the name of the Republic of Biafra. One of the biggest myths in support of the Nigerian war policy to crush Biafra is that the breakaway broke the unity of a happy and harmonious state. But in reality, by 1967, when Biafra seceded, Nigeria was definitely not happy nor united. For several years before then, it had stumbled from crisis to crisis, the root cause being the tribal hostility embedded in such an artificial nation. Why then is it important that Nigeria stay together? The primary reason why Nigeria cannot let Biafra go lies beneath its ground. Oil was first discovered in commercial quantities in 1956 at Oloibiri, in what is now Bayelsa State, in the eastern part of the country. By the late 1960s, oil had become Nigeria's most valuable resource, and most of it from the eastern region. Oil production statistics for Nigeria in 1966 showed that as at that time, most of the oil came from the Aba province, Ahoada division, and the Ogoni division. One thing we should know is that decades before the 1960s, northern leaders were vocal about their opposition to the amalgamation of the North with the South. In his autobiography titled My Life, the northern leader, Sir Amadu Bello, wrote about the strong agitation for secession by the North and admitted he decided against it mainly because of the unreliability of access to the sea through a neighboring independent country. From as early as 1945, there were periodic outbreaks of violence against not just the Igbos, like the Jos riots of 1945, but Southerners in general, for example the Kano massacre of May 1953. And time and again, Northern representatives voiced their deep conviction that the North was for Northerners and Southerners should go home. Even in 1966, during the riots that broke out in the North after Ironsi's unification decree, demonstrators in Kaduna carried banners proclaiming, "Let there be secession," and subsequently, several Northern emirs claimed they had a clear mandate from their people for the secession of the North. Why then would the staying together of Nigeria become so important in 1967? It has been suggested that the change in the northern ruling elite's attitude to secession comes from the realization that the breakup of the regions would mean each region had to depend largely on the revenue they generate. This also sums up the major problem with the Aburi Accord, which Gowon unwittingly agreed to, that in a loose confederation, the virtually autonomous regions would depend on their own revenue. The central government was supported and pushed by some external forces. We will come to those in a bit. This was because, if the East seceded, it's not only that Nigeria would lose most of its oil revenue, but also Britain, the main buyer of Nigerian oil, would lose access, and some international businesses would lose investments in the East, or would at least have to renegotiate with the new country. This economic factor made the federal government and its foreign supporters determined to keep Nigeria united. It's not far-fetched to conclude that if the Biafrans had had as their homeland an arid region, they would have been allowed to depart from Nigeria with cries of good riddance in their ears. On the 30th of May 1967, Ojukwu declared the independence of the eastern region, proclaiming it the Republic of Biafra. Gowon declared the secession illegal and briskly launched what he thought would be a quick police action to make them toe the line. He was wrong. It immediately escalated into a full-scale war. At the onset, federal troops captured several border towns and pushed into the eastern region. The Biafran forces, despite being smaller and poorly equipped, launched daring offensives, including a Midwest invasion and a push toward Lagos, ostensibly with the wild hope that an alliance of all the regions in the south would force the federal government to negotiate. However, these advances soon stopped and were subsequently reversed. Meanwhile, in the background, other countries had picked sides and were showing support for either Nigeria or Biafra, largely based on economic interests, regional influence, and internal political considerations. One rarely discussed reason for the initial rush to show support for the Nigerian federal government was that most of the diplomats underestimated the Easterners' ability and determination to defend themselves. They therefore advised their countries to rely on Gowon's boast that a short surgical police action would settle the eastern region's discontentment in a matter of days. This turned out to be very wrong. The most significant backer of the Nigerian government was Britain. As Nigeria's former colonial ruler, Britain had strong political and economic ties to the country, but its support during the war was driven far more by oil than by sentiment. British companies controlled about 90% of Nigeria's oil production at the time, much of which supplied Britain itself. The possibility of Biafra becoming an independent state threatened British access to this vital resource. As a result, Britain provided the Nigerian government with substantial military equipment, training, and diplomatic support. The United States took a more restrained approach. While the U.S. government was uncomfortable with the scale of violence in Biafra, it also wanted to maintain good relations with Britain and avoid direct involvement. Additionally, despite America's sympathy for the Biafran people, its officials feared that endorsing Biafra's independence might inspire similar separatist movements across Africa. There was also the concern that civil wars in Africa could create opportunities for communist influence. For these reasons, the United States refrained from supporting Biafra and largely limited its engagement to diplomatic gestures for Nigeria. The Soviet Union also supported the Nigerian government, not out of ideological alignment, but for strategic and economic reasons. This was one of the rare cases where Britain and the USSR were on the same side during the Cold War. Nigeria sought to purchase aircrafts and other heavy weapons, something the USSR could easily supply. Moscow saw this as an opportunity to make money and improve relations with Nigeria, one of Africa's most influential states. However, the Soviets had to be cautious. If they appeared too involved, they risked provoking American intervention. To manage this delicate balance, the Soviet government put pressure on Britain to increase its military support for Nigeria, threatening to provide more assistance themselves if Britain hesitated. This strategy was largely a bluff, but it allowed Britain to declare it was helping counter Soviet influence. On the Biafran side, three countries played notable roles: France, China, and Israel. France supported Biafra largely due to economic and geopolitical considerations. French oil companies also had interest in the region, and an independent Biafra could potentially grant France access to more oil supplies. Furthermore, French leaders viewed a strong, unified Nigeria as a possible threat to their influence in West and Central Africa, where many former French colonies were located. A weakened Nigeria, or at least a divided one, seemed more favorable to French interests. China's involvement was shaped by its tense relationship with the Soviet Union. After the ideological split between the two communist powers, China sought to oppose Soviet influence wherever possible. Since the USSR supported the Nigerian government, China provided arms to Biafra as a way of positioning itself as an independent communist power with global reach. Supporting Biafra also gave China an opportunity to challenge Soviet authority and demonstrate its willingness to assist revolutionary movements abroad. Israel's involvement in the conflict was more complicated. On one hand, supporting the Nigerian government could have improved Israel's strained relationship with many African countries, most of which opposed Israel because of the Palestinian conflict. On the other hand, public opinion within Israel strongly favored the Igbo people, whom many Israelis felt a cultural and historical sympathy toward. Caught between international diplomacy and domestic pressure, Israel attempted to maintain connections with both sides. While it did not openly align itself with Biafra, it provided discreet assistance while still keeping channels open with the Nigerian government. On the diplomatic end, Tanzania, Ivory Coast, Gabon, and Zambia recognized Biafra as a sovereign state during the war. Biafra received commendable support from several religious and humanitarian groups, but this support was nowhere near enough. The media became a major part of the war, and Biafra became famous for shocking images of starving children. These images appeared on global television networks and made Biafra a symbol of human suffering. Journalists like Frederick Forsyth drew international attention to the crisis, arguing that the world was ignoring mass suffering. One of the most tragic aspects of the war was hunger. Nigeria imposed a strict blockade on Biafra, cutting off food, medicine, and other necessary supplies. This led to famine, disease, and countless deaths. Humanitarian agencies like the Red Cross and Catholic missions tried to deliver aid, but Nigerian military restrictions made it extremely difficult. Historians describe the Nigerian tactic as "starve them out." By late 1969, Biafra was surrounded and shrinking. Its territory had been reduced to a small enclave in the southeast. One of the final operations was Operation Tailwind, a major Nigerian offensive to break the last Biafran strongholds. The Biafran army, by this time, exhausted and poorly supplied, could not hold out. In the second week of January 1970, Biafra gave up. Ojukwu departed into exile in the Republic of Ivory Coast, and Major General Philip Effiong announced the end of the conflict and negotiated the terms of surrender. Biafra officially surrendered to Nigeria on the 15th of January 1970. Gowon declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished, and promised reconciliation, reconstruction, and reintegration for the defeated Biafrans. However, in the years that followed, the Nigerian government did nothing to truly heal the divisions created by the war. Worse still, Nigeria had changed its national currency during the war. Many people in the East still held the old notes by the time the fighting ended. The policy adopted by the government was an award of 20 Nigerian pounds to every Easterner, no matter how much money they had in their bank accounts before the war. Many saw this as a scheme to impede the effective economic recovery of the Eastern region. Around the same time, the government introduced the Indigenization Decree, which required all foreign companies in Nigeria to sell part of their ownership to Nigerian citizens. While the goal was to give Nigerians more control of their economy, most Easterners, who had been left with just £20, could not afford to buy shares. As a result, the main beneficiaries of the policy were wealthy Yoruba and Hausa Fulani elites, further widening economic inequalities that had already deepened after the war. Although Nigeria remained together, the war left deep psychological scars, ethnic mistrust, and economic challenges still discussed today. The war is especially remembered globally for being one of the worst humanitarian tragedies ever.